Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. Today we are going to be talking about some more things that are leading up to the Civil War. And guys, I gotta say, this lesson has everything. We have exciting escapes, we have new territory being added to the United States, we have people pulling guns on each other in the Senate. So, if those are sort of things that you want to learn about, stay tuned and listen to this video in its entirety. It might end up being a little bit longer than my usual videos, but guys, there's a lot of stuff to unpack here. And I will say that I learned a lot by making this video. I learned about one of my new favorite people from history. His name is Thomas Benton. He was a senator from Missouri, and he has got to be one of the gutsiest people in history that I have ever learned about. So if you want to learn about Thomas Benton, and he is one of my new favorite people from history, listen to this video because he did some pretty impressive things. So let's go ahead and get started. The Compromise of 1850 averts a crisis. To expand slavery or restrict it, this dilemma came to haunt the rapidly growing nation. In 1848, gold was discovered in California, and soon thousands of adventurers were headed west to seek their fortune. Before long, the burgeoning western territories would petition for entry into the Union. Should these new states allow slavery, who would decide? So, up until this point, there had been a balance in the nation. Slave states and free states. And it had worked out so far. There was an equal number of both in the nation. But with these new territories being added as new states, were these going to be free states? Were they going to be slave states? And who was going to decide? That's going to be the question that we try to answer in this lesson. This image shows a San Francisco street in 1849. California boomed as miners flocked there from all over the world after the discovery of gold in 1849. California starts a crisis. Gold fever, as it came to be known, drew people from all over the world. They dug into the western foothills of California's Sierra Nevada. Within a year, more than 80,000 people had journeyed to California. As the influx continued, California became a wild, lawless place. In 1849, they drafted a constitution and asked to be admitted to the Union as a free, non-slave state. California's request caused an uproar in the nation. For years, the North and the South had accused each other of being aggressors on the issues of slavery. And for years, the two sides had maintained a delicate balance of slave and free states in Congress, just like I was saying earlier. Now, inflamed Southerners angrily noted that admission of California as a non-slave state would tip the balance in favor of the free states. So the southern states are getting nervous because if California joins the nation as a free state, well, now that puts more free states than slave states. And they're afraid that if a politician started a notion that said, well, we should just vote on whether we should have slavery in the nation or not, well, there's more free states than slave states, and the free states could easily outvote the slave states. So that's what the Southerners were getting nervous about at this time. Slavery issues across the nation. Texas, a slave state, and the federal government were locked in a dispute over Texas's northwest border. New Mexico and Utah were organizing to become territories, but seemed likely to someday join the Union as free states. In the North, abolitionists seemed to be gaining ground in their bid to ban slavery in Washington, D.C. In the meantime, Southerners demanded that the federal government enforce the weak and often neglected Fugitive Slave Law of 1793. The law stated that runaway slaves must be returned to their masters, but it provided no government aid to do so. The South felt that its property and its honor were at stake. Many Northerners insisted the federal government should not help to enforce slavery. So this Fugitive Slave Law, what it said was if a slave had ran from its master, they would have to, and someone caught them, they were forced to return that slave to their master. However, it was on the books, but it really wasn't enforced. It was technically the law that you had to return them, but at this time there really wasn't a punishment for not. So it was really up to each person if they wanted to do that or not. And since many people in the North were abolitionists and they were against slavery, they just simply didn't. And there was no punishment to not return a slave to their master. So the South were happy that this law was there, but it really wasn't being enforced. So was it really there? The South didn't see that it was even there. It didn't even matter. Clay proposes a compromise. Since the War of 1812, the Senate had benefited from the leadership of three extraordinary statesmen: Daniel Webster from the North, John Calhoun from the South, and Henry Clay from the West. Clay's ability to work out compromises to the thorniest problems had earned him the title the Great Pacificator. In this crisis now brewing, Clay, although in his 70s and ailing, once again came forward. Clay urged the North and South to reach an agreement. He advanced a series of compromise resolutions offering concessions to both the South and the North. The most significant proposed that Congress admit California as a free state, but also enact a stricter fugitive slave law. Popular sovereignty would decide the slavery issue in the Utah and New Mexico territories. Clay's attempt at sectional justice garnered wide support. So, Clay proposes that, well, why don't we leave it up to the people? Leave it up to the people that live in these new territories. If they want it to be a slave state, they can vote, and if the majority says yes, it is a slave state, it's a slave state. If the majority vote that it is a free state, it's a free state. So that's what Clay's compromise was, and that the North liked that, and the South, the people from the South liked that he proposed a stricter fugitive slave law. Because if you remember, I said that the fugitive slave law as it was didn't really have any punishment for not following it. So a lot of people just didn't. So this Clay's compromise would put more of a punch behind the fugitive slave law. And the South like that, and the North like that the new territories would be able to decide whether or not they would be a free state or slave state. Calhoun and Webster debate Clay's plan. The Senate's other two giants, Calhoun and Webster, prepared long and deeply passionate responses to Clay's proposal. Calhoun was too sick and weak to deliver his own speech, but he watched defiantly from his seat as a younger colleague read it for him. Calhoun's speech expressed his fear that the agitation on the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end in disunion. He's saying that if we keep talking about this issue, it's going to end in disunion or breaking apart. But Calhoun did not believe in Clay's proposal gave the South enough protection. If the North would not submit to the South's demands, quote, "Let the states agree to separate and part in peace. If you are unwilling that we shall part in peace, tell us so and we shall know what to do." In other words, if the North did not agree, the South would secede or break away from the Union. Daniel Webster, also ill and nearing the end of his life, tried to rally both Northerners and Southerners to the cause of unity. In an emotional speech, Webster urged senators to accept Clay's compromise. He suggested that the cotton and tobacco crops that flourished under slavery would not grow in California. Thus he argued, popular sovereignty would allow the South to feel a measure of comfort, but would not result in the spread of slavery to the West. In fact, California eventually became a cotton-producing state, although a free one. Once again, that term popular sovereignty comes up. Popular sovereignty means allowing the people to vote, allowing the people to decide. Though some abolitionists felt betrayed by Webster's conciliatory 3-hour speech, it persuaded many Northerners to support the compromise. The Senate passes the Compromise of 1850. Over the years, Congress had adopted a variety of measures in order to preserve the Union. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 had limited slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had maintained the balance between slave and free states. Now, in yet another effort to ward off division, the Senate adopted legislation based on Clay's proposals. It became known as the Compromise of 1850. So they passed the Compromise of 1850. But not a lot of people are happy about this. And this is where that person that I told you about at the beginning comes into play. Debate rages. The debate over ratification of the Compromise raged for months. Young Northern radicals such as New York's William Seward argued that the morality of God's higher law against slavery was more important than popular sovereignty or national unity. Equally radical Southerners organized boycotts against Northern goods, and a few even promoted separation from the Union. We're seeing separation from the Union come up again and again and again here, and we all know what this is leading to. The proceedings erupted into violence in the Senate when Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, that guy I told you about, who supported California's admission as a free state, denounced Mississippi Senator Henry Foote, who opposed it. Now, it says here, he denounced Mississippi Senator Henry Foote. Denounced is the nice way of saying that this guy probably had a few words for this Henry Foote. A few words that, let's just say, I wouldn't want to hear in my classroom, if you guys know what I'm saying there. Furious, Foote rose from his seat and aimed a loaded revolver at Benton. The alarmed senators tried to restore order, but Benton was defiant, shouting, "I am not armed. I have no pistols. I disdain to carry arms. Stand out of the way and let the assassin fire." He told this guy, "What are you going to do? Shoot me? Pull the trigger then." This guy is nuts. At last, a senator from New York seized the revolver and locked it in a desk. An order was restored. This guy, Henry Benton, Thomas Benton. Thomas Benton from Missouri felt so strongly about his cause, he taunted a guy that pulled a gun on him and essentially said, "What are you going to do, you little wimp? Are you going to shoot me? Pull the trigger then." This guy's crazy. I love it. But that just goes to show how strongly he felt about this, you know. That's amazing. This guy deserves to be studied a lot more in history than he is. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this map here. Based on the information in this map, would the expansion of the United States westward in the 1850s benefit free or slave state interests? So, if we look at this map, we know that California wanted to be a free state. And at this time in 1850, these territories, the Oregon Territory, Utah Territory, and New Mexico Territory, were likely to join the Union as a free state. So we see all of these territories joining as a free state, and that's a big chunk of land right there. They all want to join as a free state, so this is not really going to be in the best interest of the slave state's interests. But in all of those territories, the people there voted to be a free territory. So it really wasn't on anyone forcing the issue here. All of those territories voted, the people that lived there voted, and they all voted to join as a free state. The Senate passes the compromise. Still, debate raged on with dozens of speeches, one lasting 2 days. An exhausted Clay struggled to gain supporters for the compromise, but in the end, the young Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois took charge. Working tirelessly, Douglas steered each component of Clay's plan through the Congress, persuading the Senate to adopt each measure separately. By September 1850, the obstacles to agreement had melted away. Both Calhoun and the slaveholding President Taylor were dead. Unlike Taylor, the new president, Millard Fillmore, pictured here, supported the compromise. At last, the Senate passed the compromise of 1850. California was admitted as a free state, and the policy of popular sovereignty was applied to the territory acquired from Mexico. Texas relinquished its claims on New Mexico in return for $10 million from the federal government with which to settle its debts. One by one, the other provisions passed. Slavery would remain undisturbed in Washington, D.C., but the slave trade was prohibited. And a new Fugitive Slave Act added stringent amendments to the earlier law, including the requirement that private citizens assist with apprehending runaway slaves. Citizens who assisted a fugitive slave could be fined or imprisoned. Most Americans in both the North and the South breathed a sigh of relief that the crisis had been laid to rest. Though the Compromise of 1850 restored calm for the moment, it carried the seeds of new crises to come. So a lot of people were relieved that this compromise had been reached, and they thought that that was just going to take care of it, but we all know what really happens here. So this Fugitive Slave Act that was passed as part of this compromise, this required private citizens to assist with apprehending runaway slaves. That means anybody. That means that if a slave was running away and let's say that you were just walking down the street and a runaway slave ran past you, if he was being chased by the police, they could compel you to try to grab him and bring him down. So a lot of people were not fond of that. And it says here the citizens who assisted a fugitive slave could be fined or imprisoned. So that's if you helped the slave, if you helped them to run away, or you gave them a place to stay, or you helped in any way, you could be fined or sent to prison. Northern resistance to slavery increases. Americans had greeted the Compromise of 1850 with relief, but the ink on the document had barely dried before the issue of slavery resurfaced, this time with violent results. Northern resistance to slavery increases. The Compromise of 1850 was meant to calm the fears of Americans, but one provision, the new Fugitive Slave Act, had the opposite effect. The law, which required citizens to catch and return runaway slaves, enraged many Northerners. The anger was not restricted to abolitionists, it extended to other Northerners who felt forced to support the slave system. So these people that were against slavery felt that, well, this Fugitive Slave Act is forcing me to do things that is in favor of slavery, and I don't like that. Northerners also resented what they saw as an increasing federal intervention in the affairs of the independent states. A few northern states struck back, passing personal liberty laws. These statutes nullified the Fugitive Slave Act and allowed for the state to arrest slave catchers for kidnapping. Many Northerners agreed with abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison when he demanded nothing less than a revolution in the government of the country. So states passed laws that said that if you were a slave catcher, well, that's kidnapping, and you can't do that. So these states passed laws that nullified the Fugitive Slave Act because they were opposed to slavery. African Americans, of course, despised the law. Some of the captured fugitive slaves were really free people who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. Although the imprisoned African Americans could appeal to a judge for their release, the law awarded $10 to judges who ruled in favor of slave owners, but only $5 to those that ruled that the captives should be set free. We're talking the difference of $5. $5. I would certainly hope that a difference of $5, you wouldn't rule for somebody to be sold back into slavery. Now, this was a different time. $5 was, you could get a lot more for $5 than you can today. But still, it's not like a significant amount of money, and you're going to rule that these people who were free people, they weren't slaves to begin with, but just due to the color of their skin, they were captured and sold into slavery. They may have never been a slave, but due to the way that this law was written and the way that the judge ruled, they would be sold back into slavery. Slaves, fugitives, and free African Americans plotted and carried out resistance. Through the succeeding decade, tempers flared and violence erupted as far north as Canada, as far west as Kansas, and as far south as Virginia. So, while at first people thought that the Compromise of 1850 was going to settle things, it didn't. If anything, it just made things more aggravated. Many Northerners defy the law. In 1851, a small group of free African Americans gathered in a farmhouse in Christiana, Pennsylvania. Heavily armed, they had come to protect several fugitives from their Maryland master, who had brought a federal official to reclaim them. In the scuffle that followed, the slave owner was killed. White bystanders refused to intervene to help the slave hunting party. Although more than 30 people were tried for conspiracy, none was found guilty. No one was tried for the murder of the slave owner. The Christiania riot was a dramatic enactment of a scene that had played out in many northern communities. In Vermont, in New Hampshire, in New York City, in Oberlin, Ohio, and in Baltimore, Maryland, African Americans and white bystanders defied officials who tried to reclaim fugitives to slavery. So, even though this Fugitive Slave Act was technically the law, these people refused to comply with it. And whenever they refused, that was why they were tried for conspiracy. But none were found guilty. The Underground Railroad ferries people to freedom. Northern abolitionists and free African Americans risked their lives and safety to help enslaved people escape to freedom through a loosely organized network known as the Underground Railroad. Although it was not underground and had no tracks or cars, this escape system used railroad terminology to describe its actions. A secret network of conductors hid runaway slaves in farm wagons and on riverboats. Using complex signals and hiding places, the Underground Railroad carried its passengers over hundreds of miles of dangerous terrain. Underground Railroad conductors had to be resourceful and daring. One of the most courageous was Harriet Tubman, pictured here. A Maryland-born fugitive slave, she was known as Black Moses, because like Moses in the Bible, she led her people out of bondage. After her own escape in 1849, Tubman made almost 24 trips into the South, guiding hundreds of slaves, including her own parents, to safety. Southern planters placed a large reward on her head, but she was never captured. So Harriet Tubman is one of the most influential people in history. She worked tirelessly to end slavery and help slaves escape. She is a true hero. Okay, if you've ever been up through Glendale, you may have noticed this house pictured here. It is right across the street from John Marshall High School, and this is the Cockayne Farmstead, and it's in Glendale, West Virginia. The Cockayne Farmstead is known as a historical landmark because it was one of the stops on the Underground Railroad. The people that lived there hid slaves in their farmhouse, and it was one of the places that, while following the Underground Railroad, slaves could stop there and they knew they would be safe. So, if you've ever noticed that house across from John Marshall High School in Glendale, that's why it is so well maintained, and it's a historical landmark. So, just a little bit of local history that you may have not known. Several fugitive slaves published dramatic escape stories that inspired African Americans and struck fear in the hearts of white Southerners. In one account, 6-foot-tall Henry Box Brown described how he had himself packed into a small crate and shipped from Richmond, Virginia to the Underground Railroad agents in Philadelphia. Light-skinned Ellen Craft and her husband William made their escape by posing as a handicapped gentleman and his loyal servant. Abolitionist authors portray life under slavery. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, a powerful condemnation of slavery. Stowe's sympathetic main character, Uncle Tom, gave slavery a face for those who had never witnessed it firsthand. Set in the slave-owning South, Stowe's story featured the gentle and patient Uncle Tom, a frightened slave mother, and both kind and cruel slave owners. Selling 300,000 copies in its first year, the novel spread compassion for enslaved people in the North, but it infuriated people in the South. So this book, it tells what slavery is like. You know, people in the North, maybe they've never actually seen it. You know, they have an idea of what it's like, but unless you see it yourself, you don't understand. So this book told people what slavery was really like. So abolitionists in the North loved this book and wanted as many people as possible to read it, but slave owners in the South were infuriated. African-American abolitionist Martin Delany also wrote an anti-slavery novel called Blake. In it is the story of an African-American who chooses to rebel violently rather than to submit like Uncle Tom. The protagonist, Blake, murders a white slave owner in order to make his escape, a scenario that terrified slave owners. In the following excerpt, Blake stands up to his master's threat to whip him. "I won't be treated like a dog. You sold my wife away from me, after always promising that she should be free. And now you talk about whipping me. Shoot me, sell me, or do anything else you please, but don't lay your hands on me, as I will not suffer you to whip me." Martin Delaney, Blake. White Southerners responded by writing their own versions of Southern life. In these accounts, slaves were happy and carefree, gently cared for and taught Christianity by kind masters. They claimed that only mentally ill slaves ran away. A Southern doctor even reported his discovery of a disease he called drapetomania, which supposedly caused slaves to flee. With the advantages of proper medical advice, he claimed, this troublesome practice could be eliminated. So, obviously, this is made up. You know, the Southerners are trying to tell their version of the story and say, oh, these slaves are so well cared for. They live happy and carefree lives down here. No, that is not true. This is propaganda of the highest degree. You know, it's a book of lies. Slaves were not kindly kept. They were not, they didn't leave these happy, carefree lives. They lived a life of torture and torment. But the white Southerners were trying to hide that. They didn't want people to think that slavery was this terrible thing. And it was. Okay, that's going to be it for this video, guys. If you have any questions, you know how to get a hold of me. I hope everybody's having a great day, and I'll see you again real soon.